Welcome to the podcast, Your Lifestyle is Your Medicine, where we do deep dives into the topics of mind, body, and spirit. Through these conversations, you're going to hear practical advice and effective strategies to improve your health and ultimately add health span to your lifespan. I'm Ed Paget. I'm an osteopath and exercise physiologist with a special interest in longevity. Today, my guest is Annie Miller. Now, Annie is a clinical social worker with a special interest in treating chronic pain and insomnia. In today's episode, we're going to do a deep dive into some very practical tools that you can use to help you understand chronic pain, but also what you can do to help you beat insomnia when you are actually having an insomniac episode. To learn more about Annie, you can go to dcmetrotherapy.com, or you can check her out on Instagram at dc.metro.therapy. I hope you're going to enjoy this episode because there are some great tools for people to use today to help improve their lives. So, Annie, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
No problems. All right, I'm really interested to learn more about how you work with people with chronic pain and insomnia, because a huge amount of people that come and see me in clinical practice, and probably, well, you see you obviously, but a huge amount of people have both of those things, either together or individually. And if we can help people through this podcast to understand a little bit more about the mechanisms behind chronic pain and what they can do about it, and the mechanisms behind insomnia and what they can do about it, I think we will be helping a lot of people all over the world, live a better quality life.
Great. Well, I am excited to talk about this stuff.
Okay, so let's get into it then. We're going to separate them into chronic pain and insomnia as two separate things. Although I understand that people have those two things together sometimes. But let's talk about chronic pain and how, can you explain to me how someone would have some pain and then that becomes chronic?
Yeah. And so, it helps to understand the difference between acute pain versus chronic pain. So, with acute pain, let's say you break something, you break your foot, and you start to understand that every time you take a step, it hurts. This is because there's something, broken. There's a structural physical problem in the body, and that is creating pain. So that's acute pain, and it's expected that you would be uncomfortable, feel pain when you step down. After a certain amount of time, usually something in the range of 3 to 6 months, many injuries heal, but pain persists. And I think that's what is a little tricky to understand for a lot of people is they associate pain only with the structural problem that they've had. But after the pain or after the injury has healed and pain persists, it is often due to neural pathways in the brain. So, for instance, with the broken foot, you step down, you feel pain, your brain starts to learn that this is an association, stepping down, feeling pain.
Mm-hmm.
And each time you step down, way after, that injury has healed, the brain has still learned this association. So chronic pain that we, don't have an identifiable cause for is most often due to neural pathways. And chronic pain can also develop with no injury. So this is just if there's an injury to start with. But as you probably know, many, many people have chronic pain. For instance, back pain, headaches, that don't have a real true structural cause. And it's the same idea, but it comes from the brain, but the brain being in the state of stress, chronic fight or flight.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens is pain is a symptom. It's like a warning sign. Hey, you're really dealing with too much right now. We need to try to get you to slow down. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. So what happens in the brain's sort of chemistry or physiology that makes it shift from a warning sign to becoming sort of part of the pattern and association?
Yeah. Well, some of it, has to do with like the way our brain's been working throughout our life. So like, let's take someone who, has a lot of stress in childhood, maybe some traumatic experiences, anxiety, things like that that they're dealing with. The brain is going to be much more likely. It's much more sensitized, right? So a lot of times chronic pain is described as central sensitization.
Hmm.
And, what I think really that means is that the brain has become really sensitized in that state of chronic stress. It has learned how to work that way much more of the time in that state of stress. So, if you're someone who's experienced that stress, you're probably more likely to develop chronic pain because your brain is so used to working this way,
Hmm.
anyways. Um, does that mean everyone who has trauma from their childhood or adulthood will develop pain? No. It really depends on how your brain works. And, if your brain tends to like focus on something, latch on to something, and have trouble letting go of it, like, are you a ruminator? Do
Hmm.
you turn on things over and over again and have trouble letting things go? It might be more likely that you will develop chronic pain because that's what it is. It's attention to it, right? Passing pain, everyone has that. One day they wake up with a sore back, or they get a headache, or something like that can come up, but it's the response to it,
Hmm.
right? So do we feel panicked, anxious, stressed? Do we feel, consumed by it? Those things keep it going, because what happens is the brain really perceives the sensation as dangerous. And because our brain is built to protect us, it's going to latch onto that and alert you every time. Danger. Hey, this sensation is a problem. Pay attention. That's kind of a
Mm.
lot of information, but I'm.
Yeah, no, it's great. And so, with your clinical practice as a clinical social worker, do you see one area that people have more pain in than others?
um, I see all kinds of issues. I do think chronic back pain and chronic headaches are probably the two most
Hmm.
frequent types of pain I see. And, the trouble with back pain is, the typical course of action is, as you probably know, is to go to the doctor, get a scan of some kind.
Yeah.
Um, and, what I've really learned through this work is the scans and the issues they find don't necessarily cause pain
Hmm.
itself, right? So you can have some of these structural issues and have no pain in that area. Um, and the downside of this is that people get really locked into, oh, I have this structural issue. I see
Yes.
you reacting because you know
Yes.
that how this goes. And it's very hard to get out of their mind that to separate this is not
Yeah.
necessarily causing the problem. So I think sometimes back pain can actually be harder to work with because of that.
Interesting.
Um, Headaches, there isn't usually the same kind of structural issue to connect it to in the same way.
Hmm. Yeah. It's like back pain. When I have a patient who comes in with, reams of MRIs and X-rays and so on, and they say, well, I'm a mess. There's all these things going wrong.
Yeah.
I know that this person already is going to be hard to help because they are 100% convinced that their back pain is a structural problem. And then it's like, okay, well, we have to look at the statistics that show maybe a third of people have a structural problem and back pain. A third of people have back pain without a structural problem, and a third of people have a big structural problem and no back pain. So, are they really that third that has the structural problem and pain? So that's the first question. And myself, and I think I've mentioned this before on the podcast, but I saw a chiropractor years and years and years ago when I was 21, and I was actually fine, as in I had no problems. I actually wanted to get better at endurance sports. I was doing triathlons, and he took an X-ray of my back And he put it next to another x-ray, a perfect x-ray of a perfect spine. And he said, you seem like a smart kid. You tell me what's the difference between the two? And I was like, well, that looks different. He's like, yeah, that's a spondylolisthesis. I'm like, that looks different. He's like, that's Small's nodes. And he pointed out all the problems in my back. And I was like, okay,
Mhm.
what do I do? And he's like, well, first thing is you got to come see me 3 times a week for, forever. I was like, okay, fine. And I was naive enough to fall for it. And then I started developing back pain. And then in my mind, I was
Okay.
like, oh, that thing with that, because I looked them all up, right? That spondylolisthesis is a slippage of one vertebra on another. And that's a really big problem. And I was panicking. Eventually, I went to go and see an osteopath, and I said, "Look, I got this X-ray, I got all these problems." And he was he was old school. He's like, "Yeah, I don't need to see that." I'm like, "What about the spondylolisthesis?" And he's like, "No, no, 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 you're fine." I'm like, "Okay." And he treated me. My back pain went away. And then I signed up for osteopathy school because I was so impressed with it. And then I pull out my X-rays to one of my teachers, my professors, and I said, "Okay, look, tell me, how bad is my X-ray?" And he's like, looks at it, he says, "Were you an active teenager?" And I'm like, "Yeah, super active. You name it, I did it." He's like, "Perfectly normal X-ray." I was like, "No."
Yeah.
And so for me, the chiropractor got into my head essentially and told me that my back was a problem. And it's the same thing that happens to patients when the doctor who, the doctor in the medical world for a patient world usually is the resource, the ultimate resource. And when that person says you have a disc bulge or a arthritis or whatever that's causing your pain, there is no reason to dispute that. And so it's like gospel. It's like the shaman has told that person this is the way it is, and then they come to someone like you or me, and we have to undo that brainwashing. Is that how you find it?
Yes, exactly. And I'm like really excited that you told me this story because I love like these stories, not only because I completely agree with everything you just said. Um, but it's so, there's evidence in your story about how, doctors are associating pain with something physical can actually cause pain itself,
Mm-hmm.
and that happens, and that's the power of the brain, right? But I know this research well on, looking at there's a review of literature study that showed, and I'm not going to get all the numbers right, but um, it's a very high percentage of people in this study who had no pain at all, who had a structural problem.
Mm-hmm.
And the older we get, just the more prevalent it is. And I've had a similar experience to you where I ended up having, also, I struggled with headaches when I was younger, like teenager, early 20s. And for some reason, they did an MRI of my neck and lower back, and I have found I had disc issues in my lower back. I have never had back pain, like
Mm-hmm.
ever. And so I always go back to that because um, I'm one of those people who, even when I was younger, had, right, just like you, structural issues, but no back pain. And other pain, but not back pain. But it's always the reason. They need to find a cause, and I think it's very hard for people and for physicians to accept the brain and the brain's role and how that works. There needs to be, like, we have this desire to just have a physical cause.
Yeah, exactly. And it makes sense to most people because on the rest of the body, and this is how I look at the spine in particular, if you bang your knee, let's say, well, we've got pressure, let's say 10 pounds of pressure hits your knee, you're going to have a certain pain response. 20 pounds of pressure, you're going to double that, 30 pounds of pressure.
Mhm.
And that, the input equals the output of pain. But it just doesn't work like that in certain areas of the body or with chronic pain.
Right,
Mm.
right. And there's also this great study. I think it's a little older at this point, but where they simulated a fake car crash. So they had people like in a car, and they, had the lights and sounds and made it seem like there was a crash and there wasn't actually any impact. And what they found was a certain amount of people, I think it was something in the range of 20%, had symptoms afterwards that they attributed to the car, the car crash that wasn't
Mm.
really a crash. And it's just, I think the brain is so much more powerful than we give it credit for.
Mm-hmm.
Um, when we're made to believe that there should be symptoms, the brain can create symptoms when there isn't actually a reason for it, right?
Interesting. Yeah. Wow. And actually, that reminds me of there was a just one case study, but this person had chronic regional pain syndrome. And for
Hmm.
those of you who are listening who don't know what that is, it's like where your whole arm becomes so painful, it's like it's on fire the whole time. And they used a mirror to put the lady's bad the arm with the chronic pain on the table, and they used a mirror to make it look like the left hand was on the table as well. So you had two arms on the table. Right arm was the bad one. The left arm was actually behind her back, but the left one was looked like it was there as well. And then, sorry, my fault. They put the bad arm behind her back. That was it. And they used the good arm to simulate and look like it was in front of her. So then they took a pen and a pin, and they put it into the good arm. But as far as the brain was concerned, it was looking at a mirror, and it looked like it was going into the bad arm. So she didn't feel anything. But when they pulled the arm out from behind her back, she had welts on her arm in the same place as the pin went in onto the good side. And so what they were proving was that inflammation can come from the nerve going down as well as the tissue injury going up. And I thought that was just fascinating. The brain was like, oh, we must be injured. Let's put some inflammation down there because the brain saw it happen.
Yeah, it's so true. And I mean, this is what the placebo effect is,
Mhm,
right? But it's just, I think there's somehow this disconnect where we know that this stuff is possible, but I think what I find with a lot of clients I work with is it takes a long time to understand that how that applies to you
mhm,
specifically,
mhm,
because I think we think, yes, the brain is powerful. I understand this all in theory, but like I have a structural problem. I think you probably see this a
mhm,
lot. Yes, but here's my real issue because it's
mhm,
very hard to understand. Like, I think people feel like they're not believed, like they're feeling like their pain is made up or imagined. And
mhm,
I like to really emphasize that that's not what this is about. Pain is always real. You always feel it, but it's just a matter of what the source is, right? Is it some pain, of course, can be due to a structural problem, but most chronic pain is really has the brain being involved to some capacity.
mhm. So how does it look when a client comes to either see you in person or online? How do you teach them this?
Yeah, and I think everyone's different in terms of where they're coming from, how they accept this. Um, what I like to say is, healing takes as long as it takes for you to kind of understand this and separate fear from pain. Um, so I have some people who come in and they really are on board right away and they feel like, okay, this explains so much of how I've been, living. And oftentimes they have other symptoms so they can really put all the pieces together. And so I teach people about the brain, how pain is a symptom, like a physical symptom of something happening in the brain and how that works. And look at their life and stresses in their life and kind of look for patterns and evidence that stress is in fact causing some level of this pain. um, and then what we do is we really work on being able to feel the sensation of pain and separate fear, stress, frustration, which is hard to do
Hmm,
because
hmm,
when you're feeling the pain, it's kind of an automatic response to have
hmm,
some sort of negative reaction. So there's a piece of the therapy I do that's called somatic tracking, which is in the moment, sitting either, online or in the room, we feel the sensation, kind of go through it and talk through it and do, it's mindfulness, but combined with, you know, um, kind of like an exposure to the sensation, like you
hmm,
feel it. Let's talk through what's happening. What do you notice? And then shifting on to more positive sensations. So, practicing this as a skill is I can feel it, I can relate to it differently.
hmm.
And then overall, the goal with this is to keep that going, keep practicing and learning that the pain doesn't equal fear, and these things are separate and I can have this. And then the brain starts to let go of that focus on it.
Mhm.
Um, and most people have some level of improvement doing this.
So, with those people, isn't there a danger that you're asking them to focus on the pain and that makes them more focused on the pain or not?
Mhm. Yeah. And there's some different strategies. Like sometimes, like I call it kind of resting your attention on it,
Right.
but not with intensity, with kind of this sense of like a little more calm rather than, the negative emotion. But yeah, sometimes when we do that, people feel the pain more and kind of will react and focus more on the pain temporarily. And so what I do in those cases is kind of shift the focus onto something more positive a little
Mhm.
sooner and introduce this slower. So our brain has trouble focusing on two different things at the exact same time, even though we all do it
Yeah.
multitasking. It's actually not
It's not
that
good at it.
right. It really can only truly focus on one thing at a time.
Yeah.
So when they're feeling the pain and start to imagine like a positive memory or a calm place, I have kind of different things that I use to encourage that, even just shifting attention onto breath, where you
Mhm.
feel the breath, feeling your body relax. It shifts. It's interesting because the pain can go up and down in those moments, but it shifts the focus. And I think most people who have chronic pain haven't really tried to explore what it's like to shift the focus.
Mhm.
It's pretty powerful.
Interesting. And there's usually an emotion attached to the pain as well, and you're shifting that emotion to separate it from fear and pain to pain and interest or pain and something else.
Like neutrality. Yeah. Just like
Neutrality.
not caring.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because if you don't care, right? If you really truly don't care that the pain is there, your brain isn't going to attach all this meaning to it. And it's
Hmm.
not going to keep, focusing on it in the same way.
Hmm.
So, for instance, people who have like a passing headache or a passing backache or, whatever kind of
Yeah.
passing issue, they have, it's like, oh, yeah, this is just here. I don't really care. It's going to go away. It's
Hmm.
a neutral attitude most of the time. What keeps pain going is the fear, frustration, annoyance, like stress. What am I going to do today? When's this going to end? That's the difference, I think,
Hmm.
what makes pain stick around longer.
Hmm. Can you give us an example of someone you've worked with that maybe their sort of previous history predisposed them, like you said, trauma or something, then they had pain, and you work with them, things changed? Anything? I was
Hmm.
putting you on the spot there, but anything come to mind?
Yeah, no, that's okay. No, yeah. So there's a client because this is like probably the most typical client I work with. Someone like this, maybe like different variations,
Hmm. Hmm.
but they had like a history of some difficult childhood experiences, anxiety, um, some level of physical symptoms, like a little bit, not a big problem, but it was there
Hmm.
before this event happened. Um, Really, I mean, I think one of the biggest things with this person is perfectionism,
Yeah.
right? Like that personality trait of like never feeling good enough and never feeling like anything is enough. So that was kind of the starting point. And then there was an accident, a car accident. And from that point, like I think things were kind of bubbling up
Right.
prior to that. But then the event is what happens and really sets things in motion. And then, so that started kind of a series of, headaches, chronic pain, both headaches and chronic back pain, plus like really intense anxiety. Um, and it lasted a really long time. Um, I think with this person, working on the pain took a little longer because there's this idea of I need this pain to be gone now.
Hmm.
And kind of every time they would wake up, it's like, but it's still here. And that is another signal to the brain, hey, this is really bad. This is dangerous. This can't be here. So I mean, it's really common for that to happen. But we really worked through a lot of these issues of, look, I mean, I do some trauma work too. That's in my scope as a therapist. And so we worked on that, and really worked on the pain. And, what I would say is, are things perfect? No, but most people have aches and pains, have issues,
Hmm.
anxiety that comes up. But that's kind of more what it looks like now, is that it's comes up every so often, but it's like, oh yeah, that's because I'm pushing too hard, or I'm doing too much, or I'm too hard on myself. But life is a lot more manageable now. It looks more kind of like everyday stuff that we all deal with.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? That impatience to get rid of pain that we all have, uh, that somehow
Yes,
translates into embedding it further into the neural system. And I've seen that as well.
exactly.
Usually,
Exactly.
it's the ones who are like, I can't be dealing with this now. I don't need this now. Well, and then we can get all sort of metaphysical on it and actually say, well, sometimes pain is there for a reason. And you probably do need this now because you're too busy, you're too this, whatever, all the other things that they're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It does. It makes the brain hypersensitive to it, right? Because if
Mm,
you truly believe, I can't deal with this now, this is awful, it's going to keep you in that heightened state,
mm,
right? Because you're on alert and you feel like more anxious, more stressed, and it really exacerbates the whole cycle.
mm,
And so the key to all of it is not caring if the pain comes back, or knowing, hey, okay, it's going to be here now. I can handle this. I can get through my day. It's here now. It's going to be gone soon. Like I'm going to be okay. I'm actually safe. This is not the dangerous thing that I think it is.
yeah, exactly. Um, so with that in mind, let's shift to insomnia because I can see how the same sort of things might apply in insomnia where you're not sleeping and
Mhm.
you're like, no, I need to sleep today.
Mhm.
I've got
Yeah.
something tomorrow or whatever. So tell me about like, is there sort of a way that insomnia starts with people? Is there a pattern or is it different for everyone?
Yeah. No, this is a really good segue because it is very similar. Um, And I think what's easier about insomnia is that people tend to have an easier time accepting, that stress causes it, or that things going on in your life can impact insomnia. That's an easier sell for a lot of people,
Hmm.
to buy into that. But yes, if we start to associate it with fear, right, which is really common, we all have bad nights every once in a while. Everyone. No one
Yeah.
has perfect sleep. It just
Yeah.
does not exist. But the difference that makes what makes insomnia worse is focusing on it, being fearful of it, putting pressure on it, like what we just talked about.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
need to get a good night's sleep tonight because I have this big thing tomorrow. How often does that actually really work?
Never.
Never, right? Not caring, if you don't care if you go to sleep or not, then you fall asleep.
Yeah.
Uh, And, what's great about the therapy I do for insomnia, yeah, which is called cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, is that there are like specific things that you can actually do. Some of the things like getting up and getting out of bed, um, not using the clock, using the bed only for sleep. And I can elaborate on these more, but those things do help because it's kind of an automatic get your mind off of it, but also helps create, the conditioned response and associations that we were talking about a little bit earlier
Hmm.
for sleep. But a lot of it is letting go of the fear, which is hard to do, but it is doable.
Mm, interesting. Yeah, let's talk about those sort of more practical aspects of the sleep hygiene as a word that I've heard before. I don't know if you use that, but yeah, take us through, the top tips for people when they are experiencing an insomnia episode. What do they do?
Yeah. Yeah. So when I work with a client, I actually have them keep a sleep diary.
Mm.
So there's a specific type of sleep diary I use. Ask them questions about like when they're waking up, when they're going to bed, what their habits are, and trying to understand that. And so what I will do is prescribe like a set amount of time based on their individual schedule. So, what's a little counterintuitive about this is that that amount of time, it shouldn't be more, it should be less.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, there's a formula we use to figure out how much time this should be based on what they're, submitting in the sleep diary. But so let's say you're having trouble sleeping and you're lying in bed for 8 hours to sleep 6 hours. This is a big problem
Mm-hmm.
because you're spending 2 hours, whether it's, consecutively or split up throughout the night,
Yeah.
lying there trying to sleep. And that's doing a lot of things. It's creating more stress about sleep,
Yeah.
but it's also creating this association, this, learned connection that you have that the bed is a stressful place. That's where I lie there awake. So, with all this in mind, I restrict the schedule, not drastically, but to like the 6 hours rather than the eight. And this causes some alarm for people, right? Because it's like, I think I need eight. And I'm like, the data
Mm-hmm.
shows that you really need six. So
Mm-hmm.
you're going to stay in bed for 6 hours and that's it. That's all you get.
Yeah.
So that's a big part of it. Additionally, so I had mentioned a couple of these, but I'll just kind of go over them again. Not tracking the time, not using a clock. We don't need it. If you have an alarm set and you put it away or turned around, you don't need to know what time it is. Using the bed only for sleep. So what that means is not reading, not watching TV, or doing those things in bed. And I don't have a rule about screens in general. It's really in bed.
Yeah.
Don't do those things in bed. Um, and if you can't sleep, get up and get out of bed. So there's kind of a 15 to 20-minute rule of trying to sleep. And that's your limit. And then the other thing, so when we set the schedule, is you want to wake up at the same time every day, 7 days a week, and go to bed at approximately the same time as
Mm-hmm.
well. So this is, kind of your schedule. Do your best not to nap. And then giving yourself like enough of a what we call a buffer zone before bed, like wind down time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, this is something I see a lot is we're working right up until bed or studying or, whatever, paying bills, doing taxes. And then you just expect your brain to just shut down. And it's, your brain doesn't work like that. It needs time, especially if you're someone who is used to having sleep problems. Like you definitely need wind down time.
Mm. Yeah, I use this thing called a Whoop, and I've mentioned this before, but it tracks your sleep and it tracks stress levels and a whole bunch of things. And it's so interesting. So it gives you a rating out of percentage on how well you recover. So sleep is one thing, and then recovery is something else. And it measures your sleep with the REM and that kind of thing. So you can look at how much you're sleeping. But what I found is that I can sleep for sort of 7 hours, but if I've read the news in bed before I go to sleep, my recovery tanks. Whereas if I read a novel in bed, exactly the same setup, like nothing else has changed. The one variable is reading news or reading a novel. And it's like working or the news stimulates the brain. Even though I can still sleep, it doesn't recover as well, or I don't recover
Yeah,
as well. Yeah, it's kind of cool stuff.
that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, that's definitely fits with what I know about, sleep in the brain. It's
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, if your brain is it's sensitive and it's also amazing, right? So if you're reading something that's stressful, which the news most of the time
Hmm.
is,
Hmm.
it's going to notice that. Even if like not even consciously you're not anxious, it's still picking up on that,
Mm.
right? And it does impact how you sleep and how you feel the next day. So you might feel more fatigued the next day. That might be really drastic for one person versus the
Hmm.
next.
Hmm.
You might have, like soreness in your neck or something because you're not like relaxed in the
Hmm.
same way that you would have been if you weren't reading the news.
Mm. Interesting. And can you give us, like the same way that with the pain, do you have an example or sort of a group of clients that all sort of match the same type of pattern? Like so for example, for someone to get insomnia, the patients who I've met with insomnia, I don't treat it, but patients have it, they seem to have it
Mhm.
their whole lives.
Some people do. I think of it in the very similar way is we have these factors. So like let's say you have parents who are troubled sleepers or anxious, or things that they do impact us critical, right? That predisposes us to be more likely to develop insomnia. Um, Usually either they have it as a kid and then it just kind of is off and on.
Hmm.
They're, until the point where they feel like they need to do something about it. Um, Oftentimes there's one kind of event that happens
Hmm.
that is the tipping point. So it could be, they change jobs and they're in this really stressful job, and then that is triggering insomnia. For a lot of people, it's things like retirement. I see that a lot is
Oh, interesting.
because you have your set schedule every day and you get really used to it, then all of a sudden there's no structure. And it's like they feel the sleep starts to go because they're not waking up at the same time every day. And they're
Hmm.
so used to that. And that can really change things.
Hmm.
Um, Illness, death of a loved one, all these things can trigger the insomnia. Um, and then, we have these factors that perpetuate insomnia, like what I was talking about before, lying in bed, worrying about sleep, varying your wake times. So if you know, let's say you can't get to sleep at a regular time and then you just end up pushing your wake time later, it's going to throw everything off. You're
Hmm.
going to stay in this endless cycle of like, insomnia, and then like what I refer to as like binging sleep, like pushing the, getting as much sleep as you can. And we want to try to make it really consistent. And so that's what I typically notice is there are definitely some people who have insomnia from childhood. Um, there are other people who really have been great sleepers and then they retire. That's or some sort of life event that changes things. The
Hmm.
pandemic was a big stressor for a lot of people that I work with, like in the US. People were, I mean, it was really disruptive to sleep for a lot of people. So there are these things that happen. And, I think the people who really embrace this, because so CBTI is what the research shows is that it works 70 to 80% of the time, which is amazing
Hmm.
for a therapeutic technique with no
Yeah.
medication, no side effects. It's really remarkable. So as you can tell, I believe in this so deeply because I've seen it work so many times. Mm, I think the hard part is people find it really difficult. Like they don't want to get out of bed. They don't want to put themselves in the position of getting less sleep in order to get more sleep.
Hmm.
So the resistance to trying to push your boundaries a little bit is uncomfortable, and people kind of don't like to do the
Mm.
work.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I knew about the getting out of bed when you can't sleep thing. And yet, if I have a night where I can't sleep, I don't get out of bed. It's so hard
Yeah.
to sort of, and it's not even that difficult to get out of bed. It's just like, it's so counterintuitive to think I'm going to get up And then, it's like, well, what if I can't get back to sleep again? And then you're like, well, I can't get to sleep anyway. So your brain and
It's
your
so
brain, your
true.
brain starts going and reasoning and rationalizing itself to basically make you lie there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. But then when you're lying there, your brain is like, oh no, right?
Yeah.
Whereas if you get up and go read your novel, for
Yeah. Hmm.
instance, it just takes your mind off the whole thing. You're refocused on something else and it doesn't have that like wide open worry space.
Hmm.
So, I mean, I do this kind of work with people in all kinds of settings. So sometimes it's just like lying next to the bed. Like if you're in a dorm room, you can't really go somewhere else. I mean, you could, but it's not always so private.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, but even just like, a beanbag chair or like, a yoga mat on the floor can make a difference. But mentally, it is a struggle for so many people. I get that too. It makes sense.
Hmm. Interesting. So, what about the people who talk about the circadian rhythms and seeing sort of the sunlight in the morning and that kind of thing? Do you address that at all with the CBTI?
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I always suggest sunlight in the morning. So, our circadian rhythm is really dictated by the light dark cycle. So, we're in the morning, we're supposed to have more cortisol, right? Be more awake. Once our eyes register it's light outside and I'm supposed to be awake now. And in the evening time, as the sun goes down and it gets darker, we are supposed to produce more melatonin, which helps us feel sleepy and prepare for sleep. But when people have insomnia, this usually isn't working properly. This
Right.
whole system of feeling more awake in the morning and feeling more sleepy at night, it's off, it's shifted. And a lot of people actually feel exhausted in the morning and then have kind of a second wind at night, which I don't know if you hear this from people, but that's a really common thing that I hear
Hmm.
is like as the evening starts to, as it gets later, people actually feel more awake and that's their awake time. Um, and the sleep restriction, which is what I was talking about, is kind of having a set schedule. It actually helps reset the circadian rhythm.
Right.
Um, it's not the easiest thing, right? Is restricting your sleep, feeling really, really sleepy is hard. I mean, if you're a parent, you've done this before. You probably don't look back on that time incredibly fondly, but you got through it and nothing terrible happened. I think we fear all these awful health consequences, right? But new parents aren't dropping dead, the way that people perceive the sleep issues to really impact you, right?
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
So you can reset it, and we do this by pushing sleep drive. So being outside in the morning, getting that sunlight helps sleep drive, helps you build up that sleepiness. Being active helps with building sleep drive. Um, and I encourage those things, but I think the thing that CBTI really focuses on is the restriction. So the less sleep we get, the more sleep drive we have.
Hmm.
Um, and that eventually, it may take some time, but eventually it's going to override any of their circadian rhythm issues. If you're sleepy enough, you are going to go to sleep. You just have to be able to tolerate that and not give in.
Yeah. So interesting. And how does the insomnia and chronic pain link together? Is that something that you address, or is it always addressing them separately?
You know, from the sleep perspective, CBTI works so well that I always kind of treat it as its own thing.
Hmm.
But, when I meet with a client, I conceptualize, well, how am I going to work with everything they have going on? Because it might be anxiety too, or, GI issues or whatever kind of thing that they, how it's showing up for them. So if there's a sleep problem, insomnia, I usually start with CBTI just because it's so structured. It gives people more buy-in
Hmm.
when they see it improving. So that's usually a starting point if there's insomnia. And I'll do CBTI and then I'll kind of shift gears and think about chronic pain, and the therapy I use is called pain reprocessing therapy. So I see a lot of people with both these issues, and we
Right.
do a combination of both. And it, I think it does work well, for people to work on both. But the common source, the underlying cause of both of these issues is the brain, and what's the brain doing? That's how I see it.
Mm-hmm. And that's your way in as well to,
Mhm.
to manage the brain. So you work with people online and in person, is that correct?
I do. Yep. So my practice is just outside of Washington, D.C. Um, and I do some in person. The majority of the stuff I do is online at this point. So I do one-on-one sessions, and then I have been, working on creating more like I have an online course for chronic pain
Right.
that I'm really excited about, because I want to be able to teach people this stuff without them having to do therapy, because it can be expensive and not always, possible schedule wise.
Right.
So, I want to give people resources that they can work on at home, and really work through this themselves. So I have this online course, and I'm working on creating webinars that are like shorter versions. So I have plans there. I have one coming out of an overview of chronic pain, and then I'm, going to work on some sleep related ones down the road too.
Excellent. So where would people find that information if they wanted to follow up with your online course or even contact you?
Yeah, so my website is a really good place to start. DCmetrotherapy.com.
Mhm.
And I also have an Instagram account where I post pretty regularly, to keep people informed, and that's dc.metro.therapy.
Cool. Well, thank you very much. I think that is going to be so helpful for people suffering from insomnia with the tips you gave for insomnia, but also for the understanding of chronic pain that, the anchor of this physical problem isn't always the right way for the brain to work, and helping people disconnect the anxiety from the pain with that, you mentioned the little tips around that as well. I think that's going to really help some people. So thank you very much
I
for coming
hope
onto the
so.
show.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for joining me with my conversation with Annie Miller. If you've enjoyed listening and learning from this podcast, please leave a comment or suggestion for future podcasts and leave us a review. If you want my direct help with anything to do with back pain and scoliosis, or issues with lifestyle and how we can use lifestyle medicine to improve your life, email me at ed@edpaget.com or visit my website, edpaget.com, and I'll be happy to jump on a call with you and see if we can work together. Lastly but not least, thank you for your interest in lifestyle medicine.